A white lioness who couldn't give birth begged tourists for help. What happened left everyone in shock. Have you ever witnessed nature's silent cry for help? A rare moment when the wild reaches out beyond its boundaries? On a searing afternoon, deep within the sprawling reserve, a rare white lioness carried a secret burden, one that pushed her to the edge of desperation. Alone and overwhelmed, she was struggling to give birth. This was not just any lioness. Her coat shimmered like frost against the dry earth, a ghostly presence that had long eluded human eyes. But now, something was wrong. She paced with increasing unease, a low growl bubbling under her breath. Her powerful body, usually a symbol of wild grace, weakened visibly with each passing hour, her breathing heavy, uneven, filled with a quiet urgency that broke the natural rhythm of the wild. As the golden safari trucks rounded a bend, their engines pulsing in the humid air, the unimaginable happened. The lioness walked steadily toward the tourists, her amber eyes filled with a rare, vulnerable plea. Confusion rippled through the group. Cameras hovered, hands paused mid-air. She was stepping into their world, an unspoken call for help that no one had ever expected. Time seemed to freeze. The usually fierce queen of the savannah lowered her massive frame onto the dirt, her body trembling, not from fear of humans, but from the pain of labor gone wrong. Her gaze met one of the local guides, someone attuned to the language of the wild, and in that moment, the line between human and nature blurred. The lioness had chosen to trust, even in helplessness. What would the guide do in this uncanny moment? Could they save her, or was something darker lurking just beyond the golden grass? The answer was just beginning to unfold. The poacher moved in the shadows, his dark silhouette barely visible against the fading light of the reserve. He watched the rare white lioness from a distance, his eyes cold and calculating. His presence was a silent threat to the fragile peace of the land. This man was no ordinary hunter. He carried a deep grudge against the wildlife protection efforts that had gained momentum in the area. Every step he took was fueled by a mix of greed and something far darker, a desire to dominate the wild, to assert control over every inch of the land and its inhabitants. His face, weathered and hardened by years in the wilderness, revealed traces of bitterness. The eco-tourists and conservationists had driven him into the margins, turning him away from the livelihoods he once knew. But beyond the anger, another, more twisted motive lay beneath. He wanted power, a way to command respect and fear, to bend the natural order to his will. The white lioness, with her shimmering coat and vulnerable state, was an obstacle and an opportunity. As the lioness approached the tourists, the poacher's lips curled into a harsh smile. He moved silently between the trees, tracking the group with a predator's precision. His mind raced with plans to disrupt the protected areas, to weaken the efforts he resented so deeply. He knew the sight of the rare white lioness begging for help would unsettle those who worked to save her. It was a chance to shake their resolve, to remind them of their limitations. But the poacher underestimated the strength of compassion in the heart of the guide who now stepped forward. The balance was shifting, and the man with the hardened soul was about to face a challenge he hadn't prepared for, a challenge that could change everything. What would happen when the shadow met the light? The answer was closer than anyone expected. The guide stepped forward, his heart pounding beneath the weight of what he was witnessing. This was no ordinary lioness. A snowy fur stained with dust, thin and trembling, she carried the weight of a rare miracle, struggling to come alive within her. He had seen many animals in distress before, but never one this vulnerable, this desperate. His name was Elias, a man shaped by the land, by the stories whispered through generations of those who lived in harmony with nature. Elias understood the language of the wild. Not in words, but in the steady rise and fall of breath, in the flicker of eyes reflecting the moonlight. He had seen the white lioness once before, mighty and proud, a symbol of rarity and grace. Now she approached strangers, an unheard-of act that chilled him with its urgency. Why had she come to them? Could she trust humans in her weakest moment? Would they help or flee in fear? Elias's mind raced with questions none dared voice aloud. The tourists watched, frozen between awe and alarm, unsure whether to move closer or run. Elias knew the risks. Approaching a lioness in labor was dangerous enough, but the deeper truth gnawed at him. What if this plea for help was not just physical? What if it was a sign, a warning of something darker creeping through the reserve's underbrush? There was talk of poachers, shadowy figures slipping through the trees, their presence almost a ghost story. But Elias had seen enough to know shadows were very real and very dangerous. He hesitated for a moment, weighing his duty against his doubts. Could he protect her without stirring the threats lurking nearby? Could kindness alone save a creature so rare and broken? Compassion surged stronger than fear. Elias stepped closer to the lioness, his voice soft and calm, a promise that they were not alone. Yet beneath his resolve, doubt lingered. Would his actions bring salvation or invite peril? The white lioness's eyes locked onto his, pleading for a shepherd in the wilderness, a fragile hope flickering amid the vast unknown. And Elias knew this moment would change everything. The air was thick with tension as Elias moved cautiously toward the trembling white lioness. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. But the cool dusk did little to ease the warmth radiating from the lioness's struggling body. Her breaths came ragged and uneven, eyes half-lidded, yet scanning the horizon as if searching for something, or someone, to protect her in this vulnerable moment. Suddenly, from the thicket nearby, a low rustling drew Elias's attention. His heart clenched. He knew that sound all too well. Emerging from the shadows was a figure, tall and stern, moving with a careful, deliberate pace. It was the poacher, a silent threat that lingered like a dark cloud over the reserve. Elias's breath caught not from fear alone, but from the weight of what this encounter might mean. The poacher's presence wasn't merely a chance crossing, it was a collision of two very different worlds. The guide stepped between the lioness and the man, his eyes steady but wary, searching for a way to diffuse this invisible line of hostility. "Why are you here?" Elias asked quietly, keeping his voice calm but firm. "She needs help." The poacher's gaze flickered with something unspoken, resentment, pain, maybe even regret, but his voice was hard when he replied, "This land doesn't belong to the weak." Elias knew there was more beneath those words, something tangled and bitter. Still, he refused to let fear control him. She's not weak. She's fighting to bring new life into this world. Between them hung a fragile silence, broken only by the labored breathing of the lioness and the distant calls of evening birds. Elias watched the poacher closely, sensing the storm of emotions inside the man, a mix of anger, loss, and an old wound he had yet to reveal. "I'm here to help," Elias said again, stepping forward, "and I believe you can be part of that too." The poacher's eyes narrowed, a distant flicker softening within them, but the threat of what might come next hung like a fragile thread, delicate, uncertain, but alive. The encounter was dangerous, yes, not because of fists or fury, but because of the fragile hope balanced on the edge of trust and fear. At that moment, the lioness shifted, her gaze locking onto Elias's once more, as if silently begging him not to falter. And in that brief, wordless exchange, Elias made a silent vow to protect her, no matter what shadows prowled nearby, even if it meant standing face to face with the hardest hearts in the wild. The distant rustle of leaves stirred the evening air as the poacher's hardened expression softened for a fleeting second, an expression Elias had not expected to see. It was then, in that brief silence between them, that the guide glimpsed something deeper, a hidden wound beneath layers of bitterness. He studied the poacher cautiously, sensing the walls around him were built not only by cruelty, but by pain. "Why do you carry such a weight?" Elias asked gently, diving beyond the harsh words and cold eyes. The poacher's lips tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, almost as if forced by the dusk itself, a story began to unravel, a story of loss buried too deep for many to understand. Years ago, the poacher had lost someone precious to the wild, not through fault of the animals, but through a tragic accident, a stray moment of chaos in the very land he now haunted. The loss had shattered his world. It seeded a bitter resentment, not just toward the forest, but toward those who sought to defend it. It wasn't always like this, the poacher admitted quietly, voice cracked and raw beneath the hardened mask. I once believed in balance, in respect, until everything I cared for slipped through my fingers like sand. Elias listened, the weight of that confession heavy in the cooling air. Was this the wellspring of the poacher's cruelty, or was it a mask, hiding something darker still, perhaps a fear that even he could not face? The guide's mind raced with questions. Could this pain justify the cruelty? Could it explain years of harm done to the land and its creatures? Yet amid the suspicion that lingered, Elias felt no judgment. Instead, a fragile thread of understanding wove through the night. Maybe this man, bound by grief, was not wholly lost to the harshness he'd become. Maybe beneath the anger lurked a man who still yearned for peace and a chance to heal old wounds. But the guide knew trust would not come easily. The poacher's past actions cast long shadows, and the future was uncertain. Could Elias reach past the pain and bitterness to find something real? Could compassion break through years of hardened resolve? The lioness's heavy breath broke the stillness, a reminder that the night, and the life she struggled to protect, was pressing on. Time was slipping. Elias had to decide. Would he stand firm in hope, or retreat into the safer certainty of suspicion? The answer was not yet clear, but the first step had been taken. Elias stood still, the cool night air pressing softly against his skin as the weight of the poacher's confession settled between them. The guide's heart thudded with an uneasy mix of sorrow and resolve. This was not the enemy he had imagined. Behind the bitter words and harsh actions lay a man broken by loss. A man who, beneath the harsh exterior, still carried the scars of love and grief. Slowly, Elias took a step forward, never breaking eye contact. I can see the pain, he said quietly, voice steady but gentle. But I also see a chance. Maybe not just for the lioness, but for you too. You don't have to be defined by what's happened. There's still time to change. The poacher looked away, jaw tight. For a moment silence fell again, heavy and full of unspoken thoughts. Then something shifted. A flicker of vulnerability flashed in his eyes. Why do you care? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you risk anything for someone like me? Elias's gaze never wavered. Because no one is beyond help. And because this lioness, she's fighting just like you and me, fighting for a future where pain doesn't rule. I want to help her, and I want to believe we can all find a way forward if someone just reaches out. The poacher's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension in his body easing just a fraction. Elias took that as a sign and pressed on, stepping closer to where the lioness lay, her breathing shallow, her eyes flickering with pain and hope. I will help her give birth safely, Elias promised. You can be part of that too. It's a chance to protect life, not destroy it. For the first time that night, the poacher nodded, hesitant but real. The guide saw in that nod the fragile beginning of trust, a fragile promise that pain did not have to lead to hate, and that compassion might yet heal a fractured soul. Together, under the vast sky, Elias and the poacher prepared to face the trials ahead. The guide's choice was clear, to meet pain with kindness, to choose mercy over suspicion. It was a risk, but it was a risk worth taking, for the lioness, for the land, and for a man who had almost forgotten how to hope. The dry wind stirred the brush as Elias and the poacher moved cautiously through the reserve. The sky was still dark, but flickers of orange glowed ahead, growing steadily stronger. Smoke curled between the trees, riding the breeze with an ominous pulse. The wildfire had started somewhere upwind, and now it was creeping closer, devouring everything in its path. Elias's breath hitched. The lioness was weak and vulnerable. The cub inside her needed safety and warmth, not the threatening advance of flames. The poacher was tense, his usual hard-edged demeanor softening as his eyes followed the creeping smoke. Neither could deny the urgency of the moment. The fire wasn't just a threat to the lioness. It was a threat to every living being in the reserve, including themselves. We have to move fast, Elias said, voice steady but urgent. The fire can trap us if we hesitate. The poacher nodded, no words necessary. The past grievances, the harsh words, they all seemed distant now, overshadowed by the immediate danger. Despite their uneasy alliance, they both understood this was bigger than any of their conflicts. Together they navigated the rough terrain, Elias supporting the lioness whenever she faltered. Each step was heavier under the weight of smoke that stung their eyes and thickened the air. The roar of the fire grew louder, a wall of heat and destruction closing in. The poacher pointed to a narrow gorge nearby, one that might shield them from the worst of the flames. "We'll take shelter there," he suggested, urgency sharpening his tone. Elias glanced toward the gorge, and then back at the lioness, tensing with pain. "The cub is coming," Elias whispered, realizing the birth was now only minutes away. The poacher's face shifted with a mix of concern and determination. "Then we can't stop. We have to protect her, whatever it takes." The fire crackled like a living beast, echoing through the valley. They pushed forward, hearts racing, the weight of survival pressing down with every step. Both men, bound by a fragile hope, raced against time, not just for the lioness and her cub, but for themselves. And in that desperate sprint, something changed deeply. The fire wasn't just a threat, it was a chance, a fiery trial forcing them to choose what truly mattered. As the smoke thickened, Elias looked to the poacher and asked quietly, "Can we trust each other to get through this?" The poacher met his gaze, a flicker of something new, the possibility of something beyond fear, passing between them. But then, a sudden shift in the wind sent sparks swirling dangerously close. The fire was coming fast. The fire was relentless, its roar pressing in from all sides. But something had shifted in the poacher. His eyes, once cold and sharp, now lingered on the struggling lioness, his hands slowing as he reached out to steady her when her legs wobbled. Elias watched this change, a flicker of hope igniting inside him. Could this man really be turning away from the darkness he'd lived in? The poacher's breath hitched as he moved closer to the lioness, voice breaking slightly as he muttered, I thought the wild was only a place for pain, that it was mine to control, to take what I wanted." His words were heavy, loaded with hurt. Elias wondered if this moment of vulnerability was genuine or just another mask. "Why now?" Elias asked quietly, not expecting an answer. The poacher's gaze dropped, the flames reflecting in his eyes like a confession neither of them wanted to say aloud. "Because I saw her, how she fights, how you fight. Maybe there's a reason to believe in something better." Doubt crept into Elias's mind. Could he trust this change of heart? Or was it a momentary crack in a hardened facade, the calm before the storm of old habits? The poacher's past still shadowed every step, and the threat of betrayal lingered like the smoke curling around them. But then the lioness stumbled, pain sharp and immediate. The cub was almost here. Without hesitation, the poacher stepped forward, his voice steadying. "We protect her, no matter what." The fire surged closer. Time was shrinking. Elias saw the poacher's resolve harden, his fear replaced by something unfamiliar, purpose. Yet the question loomed. Would this new path last once the flames died down and the world outside hardened again? They had to believe it, for the lioness, for the cub, for a chance at something more than survival. The dry air crackled with heat, and the fire's glow painted the landscape in fierce reds and oranges. Yet within this urgency, a fragile calm had settled among the three souls, locked in an unspoken pact. The lioness, her breathing heavy, found a steadying presence in the guide's soft voice, while the poacher, once a shadow of threat, stood unwavering by her side. Together they bore the weight of an impossible hope. The ground beneath was rough, patches of ash mingling with stubborn blades of grass, but the lioness's eyes held a fierce determination. She shifted slowly, muscles tense. The guide knelt close, his hands careful, his respect immense. Every breath she took was a battle, every moment a promise of new life. The poacher watched from a short distance, his usual hardness tempered by a strange, unfamiliar care. His gaze flickered between the lioness and the guide, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Boundaries that once divided had begun to dissolve. Minutes stretched and contracted like waves against an unseen shore. The guide whispered encouragements, steadying the lioness's trembling frame, while the poacher fetched water with surprising gentleness. This shared effort felt like a fragile thread, weaving a story none had dared to hope for. A story not only of survival, but of transformation. Then a soft cry emerged. The cub's arrival pierced the tense stillness, fragile and precious. Relief fluttered in the guide's chest. Even the poacher's eyes glistened with something like wonder. They moved carefully, ensuring the mother and her newborn were safe, sheltering them from the smoke and threat. In that moment, everything shifted. The walls of fear and resentment cracked. The guide saw it clearly. This was more than a rescue. It was a beginning. The community they represented, once divided by distrust and old wounds, found a new language in this shared triumph. The poacher, no longer an enemy but a reluctant guardian, stood beside him, an emblem of hope and change. Together, they faced what lay ahead, protecting not only the lives just begun, but the fragile trust that might save their world. In unity, they discovered strength where there had been only silence, and in this union, victory was more than survival. It was a chance to rewrite the future. The days that followed the lioness's miraculous birth were filled with quiet miracles of their own. The cub, small and tender, nestled close to his mother, his life a fragile thread newly woven into the vast fabric of the reserve. The guide watched with a gentle smile, his heart swelling with hope as he saw the bond growing stronger. Beside him, once a figure shadowed by bitterness and cruelty, the poacher had transformed into a guardian, his rough hands now soft with care, his eyes reflecting a newfound respect for life. Together, they began to rebuild what fear and hatred had once shattered. The guide and the poacher, united by the shared triumph of life and compassion, reached out to the local community. They spoke of the lioness and her cub, not just as animals to be protected, but as symbols of resilience and change. Slowly, the walls of mistrust crumbled, replaced by a growing commitment to safeguard the fragile balance of nature. The poacher's past, once a source of pain and anger, became a story of redemption and healing, a reminder that even the darkest wounds can find light when met with empathy. The wildlife protection program they launched was more than a project. It was a promise that life, no matter how small or rare, deserved a chance to thrive. Schools joined in, children learned to love the wild, not as a distant dream, but as a living, breathing reality. The reserve, once threatened by greed and fear, now blossomed with care and vigilance. In the end, the lioness and her cub thrived not just because of their strength, but because of a community willing to change. The guide's belief in compassion over hate had sparked something powerful, proof that healing is possible when hearts open and trust is shared. If this story touched you in any way, tell us in the comments which part moved you most. What lesson do you think stands out in this tale? Subscribe to the channel. Your presence here makes every story worth telling. The next one might touch you even deeper.